All right, welcome to repurposing the shipping container for a solution to the housing crisis. The reality is, in order for us to ensure more sustainable housing, which we all want to do, more green building, we have to have, housing that can be affordable and attainable to everybody. And that's just the reality, is that's a component of sustainability that we have to be able to address. And so it's very important to come up with creative ideas and solutions that address the affordable housing crisis while simultaneously also ensuring sustainability, green building, and not forgetting about that. So that's why I'm really excited to have this conversation today to look into shipping containers as one of those opportunities to kind of meet both aspects. And so that's what we're going to be going over here briefly. But before we get started, we want to thank one of our top level sponsors and longest supporting sponsors ever, Panasonic. They offer solutions for healthier home needs from supply only all the way up to demand controlled recovery, ventilation, and everything in between that. I've been using Panasonic personally where I have lived for over a decade to keep my air fresh and healthy. They have Energy Star certified inline fans, exhaust fans to meet baseline ventilation requirements, or you set continuous inter or intermittent exhaust to comply with the various standards. They have energy recovery ventilators from 20 to 200 CFM, decentral or central systems, working also certified for cold climates like where I'm at to have the best balanced solution. They also pair with demand controlled air quality sensors so they ramp up to run when pollution is detected. Go learn more at greenhomeinstitute.org/Panasonic ventilation. All right, welcome everyone. This session is brought to you by the Green Home Institute. The Green Home Institute is a nonprofit with a mission to empower people to make healthier and more sustainable choices in the renovation and construction of the places we live. Today, I will be your moderator. My name is Brett Little, and I am the education manager here at the Green Home Institute. As always, our courses are approved for multiple continuing education units, including three of the five pillars in our Certified Green Home Professional designation under Energy, Health, and Materials. AIA Health, Welfare, and Safety may make it applicable to your state-based design or contractor license, and make sure to grab that five-digit Passive House code on your certificate as long as you've been here for the entire CEU approved hour and have the email attached to your account that receives that certificate. So with that, I am excited to welcome our speaker here, Rory Rubin. Rory, I'm glad you could be here with us, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. It's my pleasure, and I have somebody else with me too to help to manage the questions and get some good information and some dialogue out there. So I am the founder and CEO of SI Container Builds. We are a modular factory based out of the Chicago area. And the purpose of this presentation is a couple of fold. One is to talk specifically about the shipping container and debunk some myths and help people understand sort of the process involved with that and have it as a solution for housing. And the other part which ties into that is the modular component of the steel frame container itself. So with me is Dan Rubin, our consultant and COO, and so he's going to help with the slides and any questions that might pertain to sort of the operations involved. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to have you go to the first slide. Thank you. So like I mentioned when I started, is I want to talk about the steel frame container in twofold. One as a green module that can be repurposed, and one as the module itself. And so two kind of separate things. But truly, the reason that this is such a fantastic topic is that it really has been going on for quite some time. People have been repurposing the shipping container for decades. They have been doing this in other countries, they've been doing this in the US, and it's just this wonderful steel, Corten steel structure that can be utilized in multiple fashions. knowing that it has also been approved legally by the ICC code since 2018, with a lot of people don't really know that, especially in the US market. I'll have you advance, Dan. So there's a lot of reasons why the container is so fantastic and modular construction is so fantastic. And it truly is a solution that other countries have been doing successfully for a long time, and we're slowly starting to catch on. The container itself comes overseas, and I'll talk about really where it comes from and how it's designed in just a minute. But the benefits of utilizing this steel frame is that as a modular unit, we're able to keep our costs low from a labor standpoint. We're able to have our foundational costs lower. We're able to impact the environment a lot less than if we're building on site. We already have a component of a structure of steel that's already been approved. And we have the ability to use them like Legos. So it's really, really cool to be able to stack because the structural integrity is actually in their corners. And so, from that standpoint, from the outside, it might look like a steel box, but now we are able to do some really cool things. Working with architects and engineers all over have done amazing things when it comes to design and aesthetics, and the portability of these containers can go anywhere. I love this particular information because a lot of people don't realize that the steel containers were actually created here in the US. So it was by a truck driver, Malcolm McLean, and he did this back in 1956 and was trying to get a patent for it back in the day. And then all of a sudden, this is something that we don't even think about as a US based invention. So it's typically something that has come over and adopted from the China market where Chinese have created what Malcolm did and perfected it to be able to come overseas. And Malcolm McLean saw the need to do this so that he didn't have to have the labor costs, didn't have to have the time involved with taking goods off of a truck, off of a ship, putting them into another truck, and then having that truck go all over the country. He wanted to find a system that was created so that the containers themselves would be built, stacked with the things that they needed, created, and then put on the ship, come overseas, got into the trucks and the rails, and easily moved. And as we saw over time, over the decades, people had poked at this. How can we take these steel containers and do cool things with them? And it really wasn't until the last, I would say, decade and a half that we have been able to perfect this so that it can be used in a way that is sustainable. We can use it in a way that is something where it's built to code and that the longevity of the structure is perfected as we go on. So we've seen this growth and progression through the decades. So why do people do what they do? Why use the steel container and why do modular construction? It's a numbers game. It's a very clear numbers game. So there's nothing wrong with the stick built houses that most of us live in. They're fantastic and it's a structure that has been tried and true. But the steel construction that other people are utilizing is something that is going to outlive most of the stick built construction. And so from that standpoint, the people that are using these kinds of construction are able to do this faster with less waste, building all year round in a factory setting, which is the modular component. And it's just something that we can get out there and have people have more homes faster. So it is similar in the way that everybody has to follow the same building code, materials and such, but it's different in the sense that it's done faster and with a steel frame versus a wood frame. So why the containers? Why is it so important? I think that there's been a lot of myths around the containers themselves, and I want to share some of those myths and debunk them. So there are over 26 million shipping containers just sitting around. because what was found is that the containers that bring over much of our goods overseas every day are not shipped back. In fact, almost none of them are ever shipped back because it is cheaper to make them again overseas and start the process over again. So we have this high volume of waste that is already coming into our country in particular. And a lot of times people we be driving down and for those of you who, are sitting on this call, you're going to start to see this all the time now because we're talking about it. So I often share with people driving down the highway, when you're seeing containers that are stacked, people often think, well, they must be storing things in them. Well, unfortunately, most of the time, they're container graveyards and they're not being stored. They're just being sit in waste and not being repurposed or used. And so now we are establishing a new kind of waste, a steel kind of waste. And so there's no recycling system in place unless companies will go ahead and repurpose them for other purposes as we go. Otherwise, they're just going to keep stacking. So this is something that is causing the US in particular a big crisis because we haven't been doing this for the years that other countries like Asia and in Europe have been doing. There's a really, so the lack of recycling system, but there's also a high recycling cost. So people will often say, well, why don't we just break it down? It's steel. We can repurpose just the steel. Why do we have to keep it as the container itself? And for those of you who have lived in the Midwest and know the steel belts of the Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit and even in the Chicago area, we understand what the steel mills of the past had done. We don't do that. There is no way to do that effectively and environmentally friendly. So that it's better to just to stack them in a container graveyard than it is to break them down. We don't have a system to do that. And there's just a low perceived value with these challenges of the containers. So why not figure out how to best use them again, since this Core 10 steel frame is something that we can do.
Rory, we have our first question in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. It's about insulation. If you'd like to cover that now, or if you'd like to wait till later.
I'm going to hold off on that. I think it's really important and it's something that people talk about. It's one of those myths of the mold and the mildew and how do you best insulate that. So that is something I will talk about. So I'll hold off on that for just a second. But feel free to throw in questions in the Q&A throughout the course of this. I'm, happy to answer them. If I don't do it through right now, I will make sure that we do it at the end of the talk. So, what are the containers really made out of? And how are you seeing these? What is the standardization of these containers? Well, there is actually a standardization of containers, and most of us will see on the highway, on the truck beds, a 40-foot container or a 20-foot, most likely a 40-foot container. You will sometimes see things like a 53, sometimes you'll see a 10, but the standard width of a container is a 40-foot or a 20-foot. When you're repurposing them for residential, oftentimes people will use what's called a high cubed container, which gives an extra about 6 inches of height, which gives a nice feeling when you're walking in, a much more homey feeling. So there's standard cube containers and there's high cube containers. Typically the high cubes would be used for residential. All of these containers are made exactly the same way. And this is one of those myths that I am here to debunk, because the containers of the past 30, 40 plus years ago, there wasn't a standardization of control of how they were made, but that has since changed. Dan, if you can go on to the next slide for me. In these 40-foot and 20-foot containers, we have what are called the multi-trip container and the one-trip container. A multi-trip container is typically used by a company, corporation that would be transporting goods and services back and forth, and they own their own container. And this is something that has crossed the ocean multiple times. And then there's the single trip container, which is what I was referring to earlier on, which is the waste of the 26 plus million container. So those are the containers that are more standard that will come overseas one time, cross the ocean, take the goods out, and dump them and never to be used again. They don't go on a truck after they're in their port. They literally just sit in waste. And so there's the single trip and the multi-trip. For residential purposes, it is standard for practice for companies to be using a single trip container. That way they have better control over the use of the container, the manifest of the container. I always say that you want to know that it had Nike shoes in it versus hazardous waste. And these are things that when you have a single trip container, you're much better aware of what has come over. The unfortunate part of the multi-trip container is that there are so many of them sitting around. We need to get and develop a system so that we can repurpose those as well, because we just don't know what they contained and how many times they crossed the sea. So that you can see the wear and tear is very different. You can go to the next slide. So Dan, you might actually be the best person to talk a little bit about the different types of containers. You've had a lot of relationships with the people that are actually selling the container. And one of the things that people often will ask about the container themselves is that if we're just dumping them, aren't they free? These are steel containers. So the interesting part of a steel container is that the cost of a container itself is something that is impacted by the stock market, so the steel exchange market. So they're not free. They should be, but they're not. But then there's other types of standard containers that people might use for different purposes. I don't know, Dan, if you want to talk a little bit about the different ones that you've come across.
And before you jump into that, in the context of that question, I see the question here, and maybe as you answer it is, are single and multi-trip containers constructed differently?
That's a great question. And I don't know. So I would like to be able to say, so I'm going to show you a plate in a slide coming up where I can tell you exactly how old a container is. If I can tell you a container is of a certain age, I would be able to tell you that that container was built to a certain code standard. And so from that standpoint, even if it had come back multiple times crossing the ocean, it would still have Nike shoes in it versus hazardous waste. If that container had been sitting around longer than that, there is no way to guarantee that the container itself was constructed in the same way. That was a good question.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to pick it up from there. In terms of the construction, we do know that all containers are constructed out of Core 10 steel. Core 10 stands for corrosion resistant and high tensile strength. And it's specifically to be able to carry these goods across the ocean. So they are made to be very strong and secure. They're made to withstand the winds and the moisture and so forth of the salt water. But as Rory said, as you go further back in time, there were fewer and fewer standards. There are now more standards in terms of how these are constructed, which is obviously a good thing. As you build in a modular way across different states, their modular construction organizations, some require specific testing of the container that you're going to use. So, you may cut off what's called a little biscuit of the container that is then sent away to be tested to ensure the exact metal composition of the container. In terms of additional types of containers, we've talked about standard containers, which are 8.5 feet tall. High cube containers are 9.5 feet tall. And when you account for, headers and so forth in ceilings, as Rory said, there's more space. There's more head space in a high cube container for residential purpose. There are what are called reefers or refrigerated containers, open top containers, open side containers, double door containers that have containers on each side or doors on each side of the container. There are lots of different permutations of containers, which is helpful as you're thinking about building with them. There may be a requirement that you have or a desire to have doors on each side of the container for various purposes. So there are a number of different options to consider. Being in a large port city or a large rail city gives you more access to containers, obviously, as they're part of the supply chain. Just while I have the floor here, there are a couple more questions that have come in. One of which I think at least one of which we can tackle now. Sherry asked, have you encountered any problems with the container off-gassing toxic fumes from previous cargo contents? Um, no, but there are a couple of things to look at, as Rory said. One is understanding the manifest of knowing what has come over. There's actually a certain class of container that is approved for more toxic types of materials. When building with containers, you should never use that class. And then there's also something that you'll see on the CSC plate, the plate on the side of each container. Right, that talks about how the floor or the wood in that container has been treated, what it has been treated with, which is sometimes a source of those fumes as well.
There is one more thing, since we're on this topic, is oftentimes people will say, what about the paint? Because the container of the past, multiple decades ago, used a very toxic lead-based paint, and that has changed as well. And since the approval of the containers in 2018. So when companies will repaint them and for purposes of residential or commercial, they have to follow along with the right paint as well, so that it's not toxic paint.
And also, Roy, just so you know, there are a couple more questions here, all kind of in the same topic of making the containers safe and healthy to live in, retrofitting them up to current plumbing and electrical codes. If you'd like to address those.
Brett?
Well, and if you're talking about the shell and the performance of it, let's get into that when you get there. And I'll help moderate those. So, but back to the lead part, I'm curious. So it sounds like, there is an opportunity for these containers that were made pre-1978 that may have been previously leaded, and someone's painting over them, which of course that's encapsulation, and that, perhaps could still bring an issue if somebody's drilling into it and retrofitting it. So, I mean, besides, just a different paint being applied, how are you ensuring any of these? Like when we go to renovate a building, there are in the green building standards and many laws, hey, was this building pre-1978? Well, you have to do all this special lead attention. So if it was a green building project, we would flag it. But if it wasn't, how is that coming up to say, hey, you may inadvertently, penetrate into the paint and into the lead, and break the encapsulation of it?
I mean, this is a really important reason why companies are taking one-trip containers, so that we know that that's not a problem. So the people that we know and work with containers are very, very careful about the container that they're purchasing, and working with a reputable broker and or container repurposer is crucial for that, so that you are not taking those containers that you really shouldn't be repurposing because of those issues. There's a cutoff point, and you have to understand that. And working with reputable people, that's a big thing, and that's a myth for people. I have a lot of times people ask about the paint, and the way to get around that paint truly is to be recycling a container that is more new than it is 20, 30 years old, because you just don't know.
Someone just sent a heart. They loved your last comment. So I think we'll probably hold off on these Q&A, the questions right now, because they're all sort of in that topic of building to code and so forth, which we'll get to.
Perfect. We can do it to the next slide. So it's not quite as easy as it should be, or what people want to think of in terms of purchasing containers. So oftentimes people could say, oh, I'm just going to go and buy a container. But now you all have a little bit of insight that you have to understand what you're truly buying. But it's also important to know where you're buying it from. There are only two companies that I know that actually physically make new containers, one in Canada and a small one that does more paneling system in the US. So purchasing new containers obviously is not the purpose of this discussion in general, because we want to repurpose something. We want to recycle something that's already out there. So there's really no need to be buying a new container in that way. But sourcing them from the shipping ports, it's a logistics thing. So going to a broker that's reputable, going to a container repurposer builder, fabricator that partners with these types of people, that is really crucial in terms of buying your own container if somebody has the skill set to do it in their backyard. There's been a lot of unfortunate incidences of people thinking it's an easy thing to do and finding that they're getting themselves way over in their head of what they have actually purchased. And so that's something to talk about and figure out and do your research around. So Dan, the next slide shows that plate. And so this is really nice for people to know that all of the information about the container is actually on the container. And so if people that you're talking with are telling you one thing, when you learn how to read this plate a little bit better, you're going to be able to understand the quality of the container that you're recycling and repurposing. And so this is what the plate looks like. You can Google it. You can go through each line item. I'm not going to do that on this particular call, the particular class, but it's very important. You'll be able to see the safety, where it was manufactured, the date it was manufactured, and making sure that it was all approved so that when you repurpose it, especially for residential, that is a safe Corten steel container. So I want to talk a little bit about the repurposing process and the recycling process and the depth that companies go to make sure it's done correctly. So I would say that, having the sustainability and the recycle component is crucial, but doing everything else after that is just as crucial. And so there's what we would consider the pre-construction team, and building any sort of residential structure, especially if you're not in a area of the US that doesn't have zoning and permitting, has to be done exactly the same way that everybody else that is building has to adhere to. So licensed architects, licensed engineers, licensed builders, and licensed general contractors. They're all a part of the building team. And I don't think that that's unusual for people to know, except that on the internet, it will often say, oh, you can buy a container over so and so, and it's no big deal, and you too can do this yourself. And the unfortunate part is that it's a little bit more complex than that. You really do need to have skills and be licensed to do that accordingly.
This is probably a good time to answer a couple of questions about code compliance. Jacob mentioned, I've seen people having issues with code compliance or lack of code in their area around the use and modification of these containers. Is there a good example or source for information around getting this set up in the local code of the area? And then there's another question from David about how difficult is it to retrofit up to current plumbing and electrical codes?
I'm going to hold off on the second one because we're going to get into that a little bit more, but I will tackle the first one. Brett, did you have another?
Well, and I just wanted to, I mean, you had mentioned that it was approved by IECC 2018. So if you can add that into the context of the conversation, yeah.
Exactly where I was going to go. That's important. So what I've realized in professionally and in my talks with other colleagues is that we have a code standard across the US represented by the ICC. So since 2018, as I mentioned, the shipping container has been legally approved to be repurposed for residential and commercial use. Now, the irony of me saying that is that we all know, if we live in small towns or bigger cities, that not everybody is using the most current code standards. So there'll be times that even in a smaller community, they might have chosen to continue to use the 26 codes where containers are not mentioned. And for whatever reason, they're not being encouraged to start to use the most current codes for maybe historical reasons. I've heard that before, or just because they don't have anybody in their zoning and permitting to get them up to speed. And so education is the best way around this. So far, so good. When you can really demonstrate that it has been approved legally, you can showcase different parts of the country that have been doing this successfully, for the last handful of years, and truly understand that you would be building to code compliance using licensed architects, stamped plans, engineered plans, and licensed trade in there, you can really have very high level conversations with zoning and permitting and building departments around that. It truly is just a matter of education because not everybody has used this before or has seen it being used. And if they're following a very old code book, it's just not going to be in that code standard for them. Does that help answer the question?
I think so. Yeah.
All right. So go on to the next slide. So there are two distinct ways that people and companies will use containers. There are what we call the fabricators and the builders. And sometimes companies will do both. But the fabricators are truly those who don't necessarily follow the code, because what they're going to do is that they're going to do what I would consider the heavy lifting of the container. They would be doing the cuts. They would be doing the welding pieces. They would be doing the things that they might not have to follow a plan, and then deliver that container to the appropriate developer, contractor, or such, and that person or individual or company would then finish it off. There are also the container builders that take fabrication all the way to turnkey. And you want to be careful to select a container builder that not only is following the code of the particular municipality they're building in, but is also licensed and certified in that state. It's really important. Otherwise, you're going to wind up, getting yourself into more trouble than it's worth. So these builders are people that are following every code and oftentimes are supervised by third-party entities owned by the ICC, so that the building departments can say if it's been modular and it's been modularly based in a factory, those third-party entities could come in and step in as state inspectors. And so there's a whole element of those things. So there's a lot more fabricators out there than there are container builders, because it's a lot easier just to fabricate and not have to worry about all the legal logistics of it. So why do people do what they do? Why is modular construction so important? Why is repurposing the shipping container so important? It's really a piece that is simple math. When you can do things all year round in a factory setting, and you can recycle something that is already has the structural integrity of Core 10 steel, you're reducing your costs, you're reducing your construction time, you're reducing your waste, you're reducing your consumption, you're just more efficient in every aspect. So you're able to produce things quicker so that people can get into homes faster. And this is truly something that we are starting to catch on in the US, but it is really slow. So for everybody who has been out and has traveled, even to Canada, they have done a much better job with accepting modular construction and repurposing the container. And it really shouldn't be so difficult, but the US has caused a lot of their own grief. So just to kind of give you some numbers, there's even more statistics out there, but doing what the companies do is really obvious. Reducing labor costs. When you're doing this, able to do multiple builds at the same time, and you're having your skilled laborers working at the same time, you're able to produce faster. You're able to buy materials and have the materials in a warehouse setting so that they are something that you can control. The faster completion time. Many times a company can build modularly 8 to 12 weeks a home, where we know in the on-site world, when you're working directly on site, it can take over a year to build something. Sometimes, especially if you're living up in the climate that we live in, you only have X amount of months to build. and that the reduction in landfill is really tremendous. I think it is actually more than 10%. The waste that you have and the repurposing of what you can use of the scraps of the container themselves is really, really cool. And that's something that we don't have to put into a landfill. Dan, did you have any other statistics or anything else that you remember from a modular perspective?
Well, I think the most important statistic to me on this slide is the faster completion. From a cost savings, there's some there, but if we're talking about the housing crisis, the quicker we can get people into affordable or attainable housing, the better off we all are. And so, I think the speed, the timing of this really resonates with me.
Yeah. A question that came up was, just any of your knowledge about these being repurposed and recycled into semi-trailers. Is there competition for that? Is that something that's being done as well?
Semi-trailers as in terms of portable mobile units, is that what the?
I can only speculate on that. They didn't go into those
Okay.
details, but I assume yes. I assume really you're talking about just that semi you see driving down the road. Could that shipping container be the back of that, I guess? Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in just a couple of slides away, but that is one of the uses for the shipping container for sure. Next slide. We're here talking with the Green Home Institute because of the sustainability and the environmental impact. It's obvious. If we have something that's there that is not being used and repurposed and recycled and can be used and repurposed and recycled, that in itself just is a hit for sustainability. So there is no reason that these containers that have been done for decades overseas successfully can't be done here successfully. And so the conservation piece, the energy efficiency piece, the reduction in deforestation, all of those are elements that is exactly why we should be repurposing the shipping container. We're going to talk about other ways that the build is sustainable and environmentally friendly as we go. It's not just the container. And I know that those questions come up as well, but that, from the container standpoint, we have this thing that's just going to sit around and literally rust out if we don't use it. So it's a good thing to be able to use now. So they're giant Legos. They're really that's the best way for me to describe this is on the outside, the structural integrity sits at the corners of these containers. So you can stack them. There is a hotel in London that is 14 stories high in central London called Sea Containers. And that is something that just showcases the fact that these are meant to be stacked and they're meant to be put into all different kinds of architects have done an amazing job of visually using these containers. And the cool thing that I like to always talk about is that it doesn't have to look like a modern steel box. So architects have done a phenomenal job on taking this steel structure and then cladding it to match the communities. And you can do that in the same way that you would clad your homes that you have now. It could be a hardy board, it could be a wood substitute, it can be other types of environmentally friendly cladding that you can use. And then all of a sudden you have this great structural integrity of steel, but it's still blending into the environment if people aren't enjoying that real modern feel. So there's a lot of customization and flexibility in how you utilize these containers. And when you're cutting them, like I mentioned, that the structural integrity is in the corners, when you're cutting out the doors and the windows, if you're stacking them, you'll reinforce them with additional steel. But if you're not stacking them and they're single level, you don't need to do that because that's not where the structural integrity is.
Or this ties in with a couple of questions that we have. One is Brian asked, I'm curious about how best to attach through the exterior skin and how to control for air and water infiltration into the walls of the containers, given those penetrations.
I'm going to talk about that in just a few slides. Just to let you know, penetrating is the way people have done it in the past has contributed to the problems and the misnomer that all containers will have mold and mildew because it will build up water. We're going to talk about how we have actually figured out the solution to that so that it's not the containers of the past. So hold that thought just a
Okay.
couple.
The other question you may want to touch on now has to do with building envelope materials. Luke said tiny homes and shipping container homes use more building envelope materials per interior volume compared to a condominium or apartment building. That assumes a single container build. What is the upside to being less efficient with use of building envelope materials?
I'm not sure that that's actually true. I mean, Dan, you might be able to comment on that. If really that you're comparing building envelope to building envelope, we don't use, there's no dead space. So we utilize our space very efficiently and effectively in a unit. So when people think of tiny houses, maybe cost per square foot, they see it as being an increase. But in essence, it's not quite comparing apples to apples. So I do struggle a little bit with the answer to that. But I do
Yeah.
believe that it's not as different as people see when you think about the fact that you have less waste, you're doing it faster, and you're more efficient. And the materials that we use are actually better quality materials.
Right. Yeah, I think my take would be, yes, I guess theoretically, a tiny home, if you have, fewer square feet and you still have a bathroom and a kitchen and, a number of other elements, you are using more building envelope materials for a smaller space. I guess two thoughts come to mind. One is if we're talking about solving the housing crisis and getting people off the streets into some form of housing, that may be something that you're willing to absorb in order to get people off the streets. The other component, though, as I alluded to, is that assumes a single container build. As Roy said, these are Legos that can be, walls can be cut out and so forth and pieced together to form a larger structure as well.
Well, and don't
If
underestimate the dead space that we have in our big houses. There's a lot of
yeah.
space that we use, hallways and corners that we're not utilizing, where in our smaller spaces, we're utilizing everything.
Mhm. If you're not piecing it together to form the rooms, are you then using steel or wood to build those rooms out? One preferred over the other?
So for us, we only use the containers
Oh,
traditionally,
okay.
and we weld them together to build this
Okay.
with that. There are companies and organizations, and not to say that we would never be doing this, but you can adapt and have structures where you'll have a wood frame and
Yeah.
partial build out from that.
Yeah, so really it is a reduction in material because otherwise you're having that studded out or framed out with some other material. Unless I misunderstood the question, you really are ultimately talking about a major reduction in traditional materials. So, yeah.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, we are still studying out walls
Oh, you are.
in a traditional sense, yeah.
Oh,
Um, but you're again, I think thinking about let's say a two, three, four,
yeah.
five container build or multifamily building or what
Yeah.
have you. I think you get away from that, building envelope materials per square foot issue.
Okay, thank you.
It is a good question. Okay, next slide. True or false? Can you go down to the next slide? Cutting or modifying a shipping container can weaken its structural integrity. Dan, flip to the next slide for me. It's not flipping. There we go. It's really both A and B. I mean, it's kind of a trick question because I'd mentioned this before, the structural integrity is in the corners. So cutting and modifying a shipping container will not weaken its structural integrity if it's a single build for the doors and the windows. As you stack them or add them on top, you will want to reinforce with more steel to increase the structural integrity of the weight itself. So it was a little bit of a trick question. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of this that I was holding off for. Steel provides a good temperature control, true or false? Dan, if you flip to the next. This is where oh, it didn't, I'm sorry, go back. Go back. We're missing a slide. So steel itself is not a good conductor of heat. And so we know this. And to be able to insulate this correctly, not penetrating the container as much as possible, and doing things that are energy efficient, like using mini splits and EVR systems and stuff like that. This is how we make sure that not only are we building to code, and so when a company will put a unit up in northern Wisconsin, it stays toasty warm. When a company puts it down in Florida, it manages the humidity. It has to be built correctly inside because it is steel. And so we now know that there are ways to do this so that if you go to the next slide now, we do prevent the mold because it is a greater concern typically. And I would say this is the number one question that I have gotten through the years is I've heard that containers will be breeding mold. And if it's done incorrectly and you are not building out correctly and insulating correctly, water gets in, water is the enemy, water stays, water breeds mold. And so doing it, working with a reputable architect, engineer, and then container builder is crucial to making sure that you're not going to have to worry about this. And then airflow with the mini splits and the ERV systems and dehumidifiers, just like you would have in your normal house for the energy efficiency piece.
So, then is it, I guess, true that you're really on the interior, perhaps building out the inside and putting up your traditional drywall and paint, or is it both? Are people also saying, "Hey, I like the look of the steel wall as my main wall, and then I'm putting everything else on the exterior"? Like, which is the typical approach you're doing, or is it a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of both. And
Okay.
so it depends. If you know you're going to have it, it's going to be necessary to clad it because you need to blend it to the community that you live in. You might opt to do the insulation and the protection of the on the outside, which gives you a little bit more wiggle room on the inside in terms of space. If you don't have to, I would say that historically people are using more of the insulation on the inside because that's just more of what we're used to doing traditionally as builders, but it can be done either way. Dan, I don't know if you want to add to that piece.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. You can sort of look at it both ways in terms of people like the kind of cool corrugated style for a ceiling or for a wall, and you have the option to essentially insulate on the outside behind some cladding, or do it more traditionally and insulate, behind drywall on the inside.
Are there other options um, for aesthetics on the inside that are not drywall that can be used?
Sure.
Like I've seen, like, people hanging up wood boards or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Pretty much the sky's the limit when it comes to design. So if you're
Right.
not a fan of the corrugated steel, people have used
Yeah.
panels, people have put wood, people have done really cool decor, more artistic approaches to ceilings and walls and
Mhm.
things like that. It really is
Yeah.
anything can go when it comes to that piece.
I
Yeah.
think one thing to keep in mind, and Rory touched on this, is to minimize the penetrations of the skin of the
Okay.
container, whether it's in the
Right.
roof or in the walls, even for cladding. There is a way to install furring strips on the outside of the container and
Yeah.
install the cladding to that. Even framing on the inside,
Hmm.
you're generally better off with what's called press fit framing as opposed to screwing the studs
Hmm.
into the container itself.
Yeah. And kind of going back to a question that was like one of the first ones asked about concerns about off-gassing within these products. Have you all done any kind of just testing in the real world? So, for example, sometimes we see projects throw sensors in the walls to mount it to mount, give real-time humidity reports on these, especially newer. I know this isn't newer, but newer in the sense to what we're doing in the market as far as traditional home construction, or even, having air quality monitors be distributed through these types of things just to see like, is there really a moisture issue that has been occurring? Is there a high level of VOCs that have been occurring? Is that anything you've all looked into?
We have, and we've had to do that for
Okay.
places and places that are very hot. We wanted to monitor that, and states have required at certain times for us to do different types of testing, and so we've had to
Yeah.
adhere to that. We follow a very high level of standardization for that because we want to make sure that these things don't happen. We want to
Yeah.
keep a product that can last over 100 years, like the stick-built houses that most of us live in now.
Yeah, yeah. And just a note in the chat, and for those of you watching the recording, we did a session with our good friends at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, US, with their building science advisor tool. So if you're wondering what is the best wall structure to build in your climate with your materials, that's a great tool to run all of your wall structures through in your analysis. So what we're finding here in the cold climates of the Midwest, it's better to put everything on the outside. So now whether that happens with steel, I don't know. And you all might want to reach out to ONR and say, hey, we need to make sure steel is represented in your tool if people are using it. But anyway, I just wanted to put that out there for everybody. So
No, that's
thanks.
great. Thanks, Brett.
Mhm.
So I know that we're coming up at the top of the hour, so I want to make sure that I cover some of the most important pieces. So I'm going to have Dan, you're going to go through this just a
Sure,
little
will
bit.
do. And
Yeah.
we have a growing list of questions as well.
Look, so I want to save time for that. So let me just kind of get through a few of these things. We talked about ventilation and air quality and making sure that you're doing this properly so that you don't have the issues with mold. Electric and plumbing. I mean, here's the bottom line. A licensed electrician, a licensed plumber. These things are built to code. These are the things that are extremely important and should be done and be built exactly like you would be building anything else. We talked about aesthetics and design, legal and zoning concerns. You got to work around the education with the local municipality, and that's typical for what we do. All right, Dan. I'm not going to get into this too much, except to let you know that the reason containers are great is because they fit on flatbed trucks and they're easily to transport. And so we can have companies that modify them in their factories and then easily put them on a truck and get them onto the site. And that makes for quick assembly, quicker on-site finishing work because most of it's done in the factory. And just the process is a lot more simple in that way. Talk a little bit about next slide with residential uses. There's all kinds of cool things you can do. I think if you just spend some time Googling containers, you are going to come up with some really cool functional homes. And you can do it from anywhere from a one bedroom to what you see in this picture, which is the multifamily unit, all the way to the hotel that I shared in London called Sea Containers. And people are doing this. So from the construction on the container itself, there's also, of course, the on-site construction, which would be very similar to any other build. You have to do your site work. You have to make sure that your land prep is done correctly. You have to make sure that your foundation of choice, mostly the municipality dictates what kind of foundation via the slab, concrete footers or helical piles that the container is going to sit on and understand that and understand the whole building process. It's that part is no different than a standard build, except for the fact that it's a whole heck of a lot faster. And really just understanding that education is key and it is all out there, but you do have to fish for it because there's so much misinformation. And so making sure that you're working with the right organizations, the right builders, the right brokers, the right regulatory agencies to do this correctly, that's the key to doing this successfully and getting this done correctly. So I wanted to just, because this question came up, you talk about rapid response, talk about getting, no, you're fine, Dan, you can go down to the community and disaster relief uses. Containers are perfect to be able to be on a truck because now you're able to get down to the disaster areas and have people live in a container so that they don't have to be transported several hours away to manage the disaster. I'm not just talking about the people who have lost their homes, I'm talking about the workers too. And this is a core 10 steel structure. So if there's a secondary storm that comes through, you're not worried that this structure is going to blow over, or the hotel that they're trying to stay in is something that they can't do anymore. So I love the use of the container to be used on a truck and used for disaster relief. Yeah. Wellness pods is another place that's just kind of fun to be able to see. These particular wellness pods are run by the Taraji Henson's Foundation, the Boris Henson Foundation. They are placed on HBCU campuses to support young Black women's mental health. And there's all kinds of really cool things. So there have been 3 sets of these placed on university campuses so far, with more to come. So this is just really cool, the design work of this. I just love. One's a yoga studio, and one is divided into 2 therapy rooms, actually. We talked a little bit about this. I just kind of went on to talk about the rapid deployment, easy to do. And there's just all kinds of other very cool things that you can do to repurpose these containers and use this recycled Core 10 steel. Starbucks and Chick-fil-A, all these companies are using them for their commercial uses, offices, and other retail spaces. But it's all really, really fun to be able to do all kinds of things. So people are very clever. Architects are very design savvy on how to repurpose this. Just some more examples that are out there. And then to even explore larger scale data centers, healthcare, education facilities. They are using containers for affordable housing in places like Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Diego, Nashville. It's being done. This is not unique. I wish I could say this is something that I created and it's something that is so new, but it's being done. We just need the education out there to make it better accepted, because it is just a wonderful way to get this accepted. All right, I think we're kind of closing out. Just more examples. The future is bright. Let me take some questions before we go.
Yeah, let's get into those questions. And are you all able to stick around a little bit longer to keep asking questions?
Oh, please.
Okay,
Sure.
great, great. Well, yeah, we got a couple of questions. Before we get into them, just a real quick reminder for those of you here, you want to rewatch this session. Maybe you missed a little bit of it. You want to share it on social media with your friends or colleagues. You can head over to our YouTube channel right now. You can hit subscribe, ring the bell. You'll get an instant notification when this session is available, or you can check back there within a week to see it. For those of you watching this in the future, but not right now on demand, take your quiz with an 80% passing rate to receive your continuing education certificates. For those of you here today, as long as you've been here for the CEU approved hour with the email you want this to be sent to and the name you want written on the certificate, you will get your certificate here within the next couple days. Check your spam at certs@gutenbergcerts.com. Take the survey that pops up when we close out, or it'll be sent to you within an hour after this session as well. And before we get into all those questions, a huge thanks to our board of directors, our volunteers, our executive director, Jose Reyna, our near over 400 members who support us, and our top tier sponsors with more sustainable products that help you meet and beat green building, Energy Star, and just achieve sustainability goals both within new and existing housing. So I first wanted to give a shout out to someone who jumped in the chat from Puerto Rico and just really explained and elaborated how they are using, shipping containers and have been for quite some time. And just sharing the many uses they have for that. And of course, it helps with them being connected through sea and having a lot of the need for that. So appreciated that comment, wanted to share that back out. But there's a lot of questions, and Dan, maybe you can look at some of those and see what kind of jumps out to you. But one I had on my mind and I saw pop up, especially because we have a lot of our architects and designers following us and supporting our work, which we appreciate. thinking about them and how they get engaged in this sector, and maybe even answer that question at a larger workforce development. Like, what do we need to get our workforce from the design of these to the construction of these, right, to the renovation, to the operations and maintenance stage of these? Like, what's needed? Is there like trainings? Are there formal certificates you get on how to design, build, maintain these systems? Like, can you just speak to the workforce for us for a second?
We want more architects to get involved in this. We really do. I think this is one of those things that not everybody is wanting to be a part of this movement, enjoys this. I think it's sometimes people think, well, it's not quite as creative because you're already starting with a structure. But it is difficult to find architects that are truly passionate about this, that really enjoy steel frame and repurposing the shipping container. So I wish there was, I personally don't know if there's any coursework out there, but I would love for more architects to get involved in this type of build.
And to extend that question again to the construction teams, the again the maintenance, whether maintenance is really at that point just the same maintenance as anything. Maybe that's the answer. But just what I guess what do people need to know on the construction side and the upkeep?
That's a great question. I think people often think, well, if I just let something just live and breathe, it just be something that will last forever.
Yeah,
But all of our houses need maintenance and
yeah,
upkeep. So I would say that residentially speaking, the container is no different. So if you have a roof on it, you want to take care of your roof. If you have your plumbing and electric, you would, make sure that everything is copacetic. Your HVAC units, those kinds of things are treated properly.
all right.
If you have painting, this container structure itself is going to outlive a normal stick frame, but you
Mm-hmm.
do need to have the ability to have some maintenance for
Yeah.
it.
Um, and that reminds me of another question that jumped up, and it was about the slab. And so I'm going to ask two questions. One, someone asked a question about ground source heat pump interjection with these systems, like can they be used, which I know involves things underground, drilling and all that, but then kind of extending that question just further in general to what are the expectations for the foundation work of a project like this?
I'm going to have Dan take that. I
Yeah.
mentioned briefly, but he can get into a little bit about the underground stuff.
Sure. Yeah, the short answer is any type of foundation will work with this, but I take the point in the comment that concrete slab is not a great carbon footprint thing and not
Sure.
very green, so we would
Yeah.
prefer not to use those to use slabs. I'd say that the most typical applications would be piers or a crawl space, so that you have access to the mechanicals, the plumbing, and so forth. Potentially a basement can be done. The other thing that has been used quite often is helical piles or
Yeah.
helical piers, which are much more sustainable and lower profile. Essentially,
Mm.
they're if you're not familiar with them, they're giant screws that essentially auger into the ground and that support the weight. I mean, there are skyscrapers built on top of helical piles. So,
Mhm.
that's something that has been used with good effect. Again, pretty low profile and easy to install and so forth.
Mhm. Now, in setting aside the sort of embodied carbon of concrete, there are ways to do slabs that are concrete free and all that. We have a member working on that now, which we'll all have some more information for you on soon. But so setting that aside for a second, um, I know that when it comes to like more modular and manufactured housing, it's difficult to just do a slab for various reasons. So are you saying is it still possible here if someone just wants to do standard slab on grade?
It's possible, yes.
Yeah.
You're then dealing with the mechanicals, water, and so forth, coming up
Yeah.
and stubbing up directly, exactly right where the module is being placed on top of it. So
Mhm.
there's very little, they're very small tolerances there. It
Mhm.
can be done on a slab, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, the other question that came in here was uh, the roof. If you want to do I think a pitched roof assembly instead of the flat roof kind of aspect, which I think we were seeing more visuals of, is that allowed or available?
Yep.
Absolutely. So
Mm, mm,
it depends. It depends on the style that you want. You can do any kind of roof system. It's no different. And
mhm,
we've done several different types just based on aesthetics mostly,
mhm,
functionality. For a single container, you don't need a roof. When you start adding containers is when you'd want to have some roof system.
mhm,
For a
mhm,
single container, you can set the foundation such, again, more easily done with piers, such that you have maybe a half inch or 1 inch difference from front to back to allow rainwater to drip off.
mhm. Um, you had mentioned some of the different the storm shelter, climate resiliency aspects of it. I think there was just a question trying to clarify a little bit more of that as far as do these get built to I guess achieve the hurricane risk strategies?
It's a great question, actually. We wanted to figure out with our engineering team how to be able to do that for Florida, for example, or for the fires in California. And there are ways to do that so that we can make sure that it's already a structure that's more hurricane proof and fire resistant. However,
Mhm.
there are ways to add in elements to make that even better.
Mhm. Uh, oh, go ahead. Dan, was
I was
there?
just going to say that, a fun fact is that a fully built out 40-foot container weighs between 18,000 and 20,000 pounds. And
Mm,
it's typically bolted or welded to a foundation. We have done some tests around, the winds that they can withstand with the right windows and doors and so forth. They can withstand 130 to 150-mile-an-hour winds.
mhm, mhm. And then there was a question about the appendages spot. Are all the appendages spot welded to avoid penetration of typical fasteners?
Typically, yes.
Mm,
Again, there are actually a number of fasteners. If you're talking about fastening to the foundation, for
mhm,
example, there are a number of kind of locks that are made specifically for this that kind of insert into the corner posts of the container that are then welded typically to a foundation.
mhm, mhm. And then a lot of people are just asking about being able to tour, to come out and check out any of these projects live in action, I guess you can say. So,
So from us, I mean, so from SI, I don't know where people are located. So we are
yeah.
based outside of Chicago.
Mm,
The residential units that we have built, obviously, I can't let you know that because I think the
sure.
people would wonder why all these people are showing up at their doorsteps.
Right.
However, there will be a couple of very large builds, one being down at Navy Pier and one being done by for a group shelter for women who have been
Mm,
on the streets that have been trafficked. Both of
yeah.
those projects will be done by the end of this year and will be able to be toured.
Yeah. Okay, well, great. So yeah, well, I guess with that then, where can people go to contact you or learn more or ask about those types of tour opportunities if they want to?
Absolutely. So sicontainerbuilds.com or sicbs.com, both work.
Yeah,
And for me, it's just my first name, Rory, at sicbs.com or Dan, Dan, at sicbs.com.
yeah. Great. Well, Rory, Dan, I really appreciate you coming on to do this and educating everyone, and I learned a lot. So Thank
That
you
is
for joining
awesome.
us. And yeah, and thank you all for joining us. We will be here back in March, same time, same place next week. So take care, all. See you. Be well. Goodbye.
Be sure to check out all of our courses available online that you can watch anytime and anywhere to pick up your CEUs. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube to get weekly updates and stay up to date on green building science courses, webinars, and home tours. Thanks again.